All right, this segment is a very important segment on how companies are using AI, artificial intelligence slash robots, in their, we call them software, special software, in their employment decisions. And the moderator for the segment is Jana Torsone. Could you close the doors? Tori, Allison, have the doors closed. Where are these folks? Okay. All right, Jana Torsone is the moderator. Jana is a very, very knowledgeable, experienced person in the field of human resources. She is the head of human resources for the Pitney Bowes Company. Before that, she was a practicing lawyer. Which firm was it?
Parker Chapin.
Parker Chapin. Will folks please be quiet? I don't get it. All right, Jana Torsone.
Thank you. I have to admit, it's been a very interesting day. For someone like myself who lives in the world of business and the challenges of having to manage a workforce, make sure you're getting the right talent in the right place for the right jobs in order for the business to be successful. I was thinking on the last panel that was up here, a couple of weeks ago, I was with several senior executives and heads of HR talking about what, with a lot of those startup entities in the world of technology and advancement around the management and enhancement of the workforce and productivity. And I thought it would be a really interesting experience to have the panel that I heard last time have a discussion, because there wasn't an awful lot of conversation about Armageddon, though those of us in the HR field are faced, and we are frequently faced with the reality of technology and changing our business models, changing the requirements on skill. And we look forward and recognize that the reality is that there's technology which in many ways will replace some tasks and some work, and it will enhance others. And the challenge for many of us is to think about how do you deconstruct those jobs, and what are the skills that are going to be required for the future, and how do we prepare for that? And it's on our minds, I can tell you, constantly. And so, and there is a lot of potential services out there, or vendors that hype a lot of things that are in this space. Not a lot of them are at the point where they're having the impact that they can have, or perhaps should have or not have. And so we sort our way through that. I'm on the board of the Human Resources Policy Association, which Roger is an officer of. And we as senior CHRO officers can continually ask ourselves the question, in this space, there's things that are going to be able to be done. The question is what should be done, and how do we set certain standards around the use of information and the enhancement of technology in terms of how do you select and develop people. So we have a great panel on this today, and I hope you'll find it interesting and engaging. And of course, if you have questions along the way, I think our panelists will all be very happy to take them. I'm going to start with two of the panelists who talk a little bit about what exactly at this point in time that is happening with the application of these kinds of technologies today in the workplace. And then we're going to have an expert talk a bit about how some of these capabilities around analysis of data for purposes of credit worthiness in the financial services industry created a number of questions about the use of that, and how do you manage that from a risk and a bias perspective, and could that apply in this space? And then finally, we're going to end up with a real expert on how do you take the capabilities around statistics and analytics and manage that in the context of selection in a way that meets the requirements of the regulatory environment that we face today. So I think it'll be a very robust conversation. So we're going to start with Bob O'Hara. Bob, I've known Roger.
We're going to start with
Roger? Oh, sorry. Okay.
She's known Roger as well.
I'll adjust. I know Roger well, and Roger is a distinguished and well-known labor and employment lawyer that practiced many, many years with Jones Day. And now we have the benefit of his great wisdom at the Human Resources Policy Association I mentioned, which is an organization of over 400 chief human resources officers from large multinational and domestic companies. So Roger?
Thank you. So I'm going to start this just a little bit different. It just occurs to me, John and Sam, what are we really talking about here today? What's AI? What's disruption? What's automation? Can you imagine the fellow sitting around centuries ago talking about this guy just invented the wheel? I mean, that's going to put a lot of people out of work, right? And you could go down, and we've had a bit of this today, through the centuries of all these developments, some of them minor, the player piano. I mean, so what? The chain and the pulley, ATMs. So what are we really talking about? I think we're talking about advancements in our society, advancements in our civilization, and the Brookings Institute probably really nailed it pretty well in their recent study. This isn't the end of the world, nor is it utopia. It's something that we're going to deal with, and hopefully deal with in a thoughtful way. There's all kinds of stats, and is this working, Sam? I don't know that it is.
Not moving.
Not
Sorry.
moving.
Is our-
Can we get our...
Tori's our technical person here. See, one of the problems, people are using different formats, and we're not clever enough to figure out a way of utilizing all of them. Is our technical person here, or are you our technical person? We're in bad shape, I think. Well, we're not able to, Tori. Well, get us one with the battery.
All right, I can keep
We
going.
call ourselves the Global Law School. In fact, some of us call us the Intergalactic Law School. We're not able to handle 19th century developments very well. Okay, Roger, you'll have to go on your own.
No, that's fine. That's fine. So the basic definitional approach, I think any kind of discussion needs to have. I don't want to spend any more time on it, but I think the point being that what we're dealing with here today is really not as sophisticated or as deep or as earth-shattering as some might suggest it to be. There are all kinds of stats out there about how many jobs are going to be disrupted, how many jobs are going to be eliminated, et cetera. And that's fine. You can test those figures and see how accurate they may or may not be. What I didn't have time to put in my presentation appeared in the Wall Street Journal just a few days ago. It was on page 2. Some of you may have read it. The heading was, U.S. job openings outnumber unemployed by the widest margin ever. If you haven't had a chance, look at that article. I think that answers a lot of questions today. As we sit here today, corporate America, the business community, can't fill satisfactorily jobs that they have open by the widest margin ever. And that's just going to continue. The trend has continued up and up. So when I listen to these presentations about the end of the world, I just shake my head. They aren't looking at real-time data. And for those of us that sit with the business community almost daily, we can't fill jobs we have today. We don't have the skill, we don't have the mix, we don't have the training. And that's a problem. And what I have on the screen, I don't know if it's going to be,
It's up now.
is it? Where's the clicker?
It's not up now.
It's not up. All right, whatever. What I have in my presentation, which you'll get at a later point, are the different industries that have faced the change of circumstances in the employer climate and have been very satisfactorily adopting same. For example, in medicine, Montefiore Health System here in the New York area recently has used AI for diagnostic approaches to cut down infection rates. Tremendous, much better than the traditional approach. For example, also in medicine, robotics and surgery. And the list goes on. The things that you're familiar with, whether it be in the truck driving area, the U.S. Postal Service, whether it be UPS, one of our members with drones. Very interesting. Two I would have added had I had time, and these are just two recent media pronouncements. Hospitality industry. We now have AI capability of mixing hundreds of drinks for customers and clients, and this is coming out of Las Vegas, by AI apparatus. I'm not sure I want to sit and talk to a machine as I'm drinking at the bar. I mean, what about Casablanca and Humphrey Bogart? I mean, that just doesn't work, right?
Right, that's true.
But this is coming to Las Vegas. The hospitality industry is going to be certainly disrupted. One that is in the Washington Post today, for those of you that read the Post, and this is the headline, Washington Post, top AI regulators race to deflect deepfake, in quotes, deepfake videos. We are outgunned. Are you familiar with deepfake? Have you followed Nancy Pelosi stories? And what was the one the other day we just saw?
Zuckerberg, right?
Mark Zuckerberg. So what you do, you basically go online and create a video or create news that's absolutely erroneous, and it becomes part of the news, if you will.
Right.
Deep fake is what we're talking about here. So AI has so many different possibilities. We're going to see it in this upcoming election cycle, unfortunately. And you can imagine the consequences there. So really where this leads, I think, from the employer community is the opportunities are ever expanding. They're going to continue to expand. If we're thoughtful about that expansion, the employer community, organized labor, and others in our society are going to work together to find solutions. The problems, and we're going to talk about a few of them, some of the recruiting data, frankly, we're using has legal problems. Machines only know what they're taught, only know what we feed them. So inherent bias issues, right, a problem. Are we going to have issues about really matching skills correctly? Probably. Small business is at a distinct disadvantage because it doesn't have the resources to compete with large business entities. So in sum, we have opportunity that is unlimited. I know we at HR Policy Association, we're bullish on where we're going. And I think the results will speak for themselves. I go back to the Wall Street Journal article I mentioned at the top. If you haven't read it, read it.
All right, Valentin, thank you. Bob? Well, please let me introduce you. Bob is, again, I've known Bob many years. He actually started out, interestingly enough, in the national security business, working at the White House. He then went into work for a very, very large Fortune 50 company in hundreds of countries, where he was a senior officer responsible for employment law and compliance. And that's how I got to know him. And he's known in our world as like an incredible expert. He went on to work in a broad association, and now he's with Epstein Becker. So he's got a lot of real-world experience on how this technology in the context of AI, machine learning, et cetera, is applicable in the employment arena and in the HR practices that we are all operating with. Bob?
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Jonna. No pressure here, expert, I'm thinking. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I mean, this is a fascinating topic. As we were preparing for the panel, as Jonna said, you know, many of us are involved deeply in HR-related types of activities. And you hear AI all the time, and you all experience AI every day, but you may not know it. So if you go to buy something on Amazon, or even look at something on Amazon, funny how your next query screen populates with things that you were looking at last Tuesday. I mean, that's artificial intelligence at work in the retail space. So you also have a very broad, it's an explosion, frankly, of artificial intelligence. The promise of AI is dramatic. And I just want to read one quote that was in the paper last week. Microsoft is piloting an organization, an AI incubator in Louisville, Kentucky. Now, you might ask why. I don't know if you saw this advertised. Why in Louisville, Kentucky? And their concern is, Microsoft's concern is that the brain drain to the coasts from the interior of the country needs to be mitigated in some fashion. So they want to build competency and they want to build expertise inside, somewhere in between the flyover states. They also said that Louisville in particular, looking at the manufacturing base there, the potential for Louisville to lose 28% of their current employment because of AI-related effects. So they're saying we need to put back into the system, we need to provide additional ammunition, additional experience. And the quote I want to read was from the Chief Technology Officer at Microsoft. I thought it was fascinating. Quote, "We think that in the next 10 years, we'll see more change in our society than we've seen in the last 250 years. And I read that, and I had to read it a couple of times, and I'm trying to think, how does that actually work day in and day out? And how many things have I dealt with in my limited experience inside of HR over the last 20 years or so? I've seen this explosion. And one thing that I want to just point out is the acceleration. There's an acceleration of activities in the AI space, just writ large. I mean, Jonna mentioned it, in the HR space, like every other space, you have vendors out there that are coming in every day. The new shiny object, I call it. Here's something new. It's going to solve all these problems. It's going to solve this problem. They're going to solve problems you didn't know you had. So this is one of those things where it's like caveat emptor. What are you trying to sell? What are you trying to do? And what's the import from a legal perspective? Because as Roger mentioned, and we'll talk a little bit about this, the risk associated with doing this incorrectly. So, I don't know if okay. Can we go to the next slide? Oh, Tori, okay, sorry about that. The thing about, we start with the concept of big data. Everybody's heard of big data? I don't like that term because it's just amorphous. It's a glop of information that's out there. I prefer, I think I've coined it, smart data. How to extract value out of the broader information that we're awash in. Companies are awash in data. Everything that we do now in a company in the United States has touched, there's some sort of data touch to it. So for example, the company that I used to work for, United Technologies Corporation in Hartford, had about 75,000 employees in the US, but over 250,000 employees worldwide. And in the US, we used to get, on average, annually, 1 million applicants for about 7,000 new positions or available positions. 1 million. So you look at that and say, all right, now you have a math problem. How do you figure out how to extract value out of that massive data, the big data? Moving to smart data, how do you filter it? How do you pull the threads of that and get the best quality talent that you can out of that mass of information? So those are some of the challenges on the front end. And we're going to talk a little bit about selection technologies, and our expert over here is going to tell us all you need to know about how to do that smartly. But that's really one of the big challenges, and I'm sure at Pitney Bowes it's the same thing. You're inundated. And the fact that there's a war for talent, you've heard the war for talent argument over and over again, and now the war for talent is even stronger because of the overabundance of positions that can't be filled in the United States economy. So those are the kinds of things. How do you now go get that information? United Technologies would raid from GE, and GE would raid from Honeywell, and they would try to get the best engineering talent, all this other kind of thing. So on the front end of the conversation, you have the selection, smart technology around selection in HR, but I would posit that AI is throughout the employment life cycle.
Right.
It's everywhere. Every kind of decision making that's going on today because of the deluge of data that's available. And I think this is an important concept. The fact that a data exists and it's in a company, the senior leadership of that company wants a return on that information. We have information. How do we extract value from it? Go figure it out. So those are the challenges that come to Jonna, as a CHRO. How do you extract value out of a company, out of the data that you have?
So let me just make a comment on, so on the other side of that, in that war for talent, one area where it's actually become more of an area of focus for the HR functions is on predicting people's attrition. So there are, a lot of companies have determined a series of variables which they believe have predicted that, and they've been able to demonstrate that is 50% more accurate than your managerial assessment. So what does that do? That gives you the opportunity to intervene before somebody leaves you, some talent leaves you that you don't want to leave. And so the question is, making sure how do you, as Bob said, how do you do that? And then there is the reality of the fact, and I think somebody mentioned this morning, that the jobs that exist today will not be the same jobs that exist 5 years from now and 10 years from now. Gardner has a report out there that shows you 15 jobs in 2007 that had this title. And those same title jobs today, in terms of skill and requirements, are very different. So how, with the speed of what's happening, how do you keep abreast of that? How do you define what are the most important characteristics to be able for people to adapt? And so some of the AI applications I've heard of have been, in that regard.
One of the, just to add on with respect to predictive analytics, which is some of the most compelling work being done today is in that space, because you're trying to stay ahead of this massive curve that you're on. But there's also a much higher risk associated with predictive. Unless you get the algorithm correct, the outputs could very well be discriminatory, they could very well be illegal, and you wouldn't know that because the machine doesn't know. It's just spitting out information that you programmed into it, in a simple sense. So for example, at my former company, on the attrition side in particular, we had a number of data analysts on staff, which I didn't know about initially. They were in HR, and I was a VP of HR, and I said, "Oh, really? What are you doing over here?" And I was always of the opinion that I want to know what they're doing. I want to hug them tight, be friends with them to make sure that they could come back and let's talk about this. What is it you're trying to accomplish? It's a goal. What's your goal with this? So there was a project that they started, and the goal was to identify factors that led people to leave the company. So attrition is a big problem, particularly where you've brought somebody in, you've spent a lot of time and money and effort training them, they've had good service for your company, they're a good, valuable employee, and for whatever reason they decide they want to make a change. Now, it might be job satisfaction, it could be all kinds of things, locality, illness, what have you. But they were looking for factors that actually they could extract from information that they had, and say, what kind of patterns are we establishing here? What can we see? So they had, and my recollection was 37 factors that they were using in this analysis, and they were punching this through data analytics, trying to predict who would want to go next. And I said, interesting. What do you want to do with that information? Oh, we want to go talk to them. I go, whoa. Before we go down that path, let's sort of let's, on the back office side, let's figure this out. What does that mean? What are you going to tell them when you go in there? You're going to say, hi, we think you're leaving. What are you monitoring me? What are you doing? What's going on? So I said, I was looking as an employment lawyer going, this is not going to end well somehow. I was looking at this. Well-intentioned though they were, this is why I always hug these folks. I hug them all the time. And I said, look, what is it that you're thinking? Which one of these factors is really relevant? Where's the correlation? Where's a strong correlation and where are the weaker correlations? And a weaker correlation, you can extract them, get them out of there. If it's, for example, they had, EEO demographics in there, your race characteristics in there. I go, why? What's the data telling us? Is there some issue there that we need to focus on? No, but it's just one of the factors that we have available to us. And I said, well, that's just not a good strategy. If there's some connection back to a decision point, okay, we can unwrap that somehow and figure that out. But the goal was to try to figure out in advance who might leave next or might leave in the near term so that you could intervene effectively and change that thought process, change that decision that person was in the process of making. All very laudable, except for that intervention step that I talked about at the very early part of this without being tested. So I wanted a little bit more testing on that. And then I retired from the company, and I have no idea what they're doing now.
So
Well,
Bob,
so
on.
go ahead, Roger.
Yeah, on
He had a
that,
good release agreement.
so Bob, on that
I
point,
used to draft those. That's
just to
what I-
follow up, who do we want to keep? And how do we get them to stay?
Right.
So learnability and adaptability. And one of our companies has this basic question in recruitment and retention. When is the last time you learned to do something new? Now, bias there? I don't think so. But just think about that. When have you learned to do something new? And that's the kind of worker we want for the future. And you can get there, but it takes some thought process, right?
Right. So against that landscape, though, as Bob said, there are lots of questions that come out. What do you do with that data? Is it transparent? Does the employee know what's happening? In one case, we heard that kind of analysis has formed the basis of providing information to a manager so they can make some decisions about who are they going to invest in, or how are they going to manage their reward structure. So there's multiple implications associated with this. And so these are the things that you know we need to think through, both as a profession and and as a society. And I'm gonna, if I can, I'll turn it over now a little bit to David, who is as I said, is an expert. He is an economist, a financial economist, who works for Charles Rivers, who is a company that works in this field of looking at quantitative economics for purposes of risk management and helping companies deal with these kinds of questions. And so, David, if you can give us some sense of how that has been applicable in your world and how you see that as a framework for us to think about what we do in this space of HR.
Thanks. So let me just give you a little bit of background on my perspective. First of all, in terms of what I do and what my colleagues do at Charles River Associates, you could think about us as the folks who do things that lawyers don't like to do, or they can't do, but are essential to the practice of law in many instances. Math, statistics, data analysis.
I had no idea where he was going with that, but I agree on the math part.
Aside from that, lawyers can do pretty much anything else.
Yeah, let's stop there.
And I was really encouraged to see there were plenty of economists on the panels today, so I'm not alone. But I am kind of an oddball on this panel in that I don't work at all in labor law, employment law. I actually come at this from the financial sector perspective. I work chiefly with consumer and small business lenders and folks in financial institutions where models are used very intensively. And what I'm hearing in the conference is that, in the labor sector, the intensive use of models for various purposes is really a relatively new and growing area. In the financial sector, particularly in banking, we've been using models for decades very intensively. And one of the things that characterizes the use of models within the financial sector is that there are specific laws, and well, not laws really, but regulations, regulatory guidance, regulatory expectations that necessitate having careful governance of the risk associated with using models, whether that be risk to the business, things like risk to liquidity or capital, what have you, or the risk of violating laws, anti-money laundering laws, anti-discrimination laws, and so forth. I specifically work chiefly in the area of anti-discrimination laws and looking at business processes and statistical models, particularly predictive models, for evidence of bias. We are going to have slides. My able assistant is going to click through. And so that's my perspective. Just
Able
to start.
Executive Director. We're keeping the title, but we've de-skilled you a little bit.
Exactly, downgraded your skills, but you'll get a UBI, so don't worry.
Well, that's not going to go too far.
So we can go on to the next slide. Just a little bit of context for some of the key civil rights statutes that govern non-discrimination in financial services. Very similar to labor law. We have the 1968 Civil Rights Act, which gave us the Fair Housing Act. In the 70s, we got the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. They have various enumerated prohibited bases, race, color, sex, so on and so forth, that are very similar to the prohibited bases in the labor and employment context, okay? Thou shalt not discriminate on these bases. And very much like the labor context, you have the possibility of liability for overt or disparate treatment discrimination. And although there's some controversy about the interpretation of the statutes, also the possibility of disparate impact liability. So the effects test, indirect discrimination, which is, I think, historically designed to get at people trying to discriminate through other means, right? But also essentially covers unintentional discrimination that comes from using things that seem fairly neutral. If we think about the use of AI or machine learning model, I'll say machine learning because AI is kind of an overblown concept, as Professor Seaman said this morning. Sorry, if we go back one slide quickly. Chiefly in the financial sector, what we're talking about in terms of the use of machine learning and sophisticated models that have potential discriminatory effects. We're talking about models that are developed and used for credit decisions. So I think everybody's familiar with FICO scores, credit scores. Okay, there are various kinds of models that financial institutions develop to predict whether you're going to pay back the debt that we're going to give you. We give you a loan, are you going to pay it back? How likely are you to pay it back? And based on that likelihood of paying it back, we're going to decide whether to give you a loan and how we're going to price it, okay? We use the models in fraud detection, like in anti-money laundering, but also identity theft and things like that. We use it in marketing especially, and this is, like the Amazon thing with Larry Carey's example of his book selections. But used very heavily in marketing. And the newer kinds of models, the machine learning type models, are most prevalent in what we call the fintech space, which are new online lenders that are offering niche credit products, unsecured consumer credit, small business credit, student loan refinance, things like that. They're the ones who are getting much more innovative in the use of models. Now, where does discrimination come in? We've had some intimations about, what possible discriminatory effects come in using these models. I would narrow it down to two broad categories. One is variable selection. So what variables do we put into a predictive model, whether we're trying to predict attrition of employees or predict credit performance? Are we overtly using discriminatory factors? Are we using things that are closely related to discriminatory factors? And then also within that category is what I call proxy variables. So are we using things that are closely related to, say, race or sex, but at least on a facial level seem to be fairly neutral? If you take, for example, one example of a proxy that I like to use is if you use the school that somebody attended, the university or college they attended, in trying to predict their performance, whether it be credit or job performance or what have you. And suppose we have within our data set all of our past employees and their performance, what college they went to, what degrees they got, maybe their GPA and various things about job performance. We're going to use these things to predict job performance, but it turns out that we've never hired anybody from, say, Howard University or one of the other historically black colleges and universities. So our data set is skewed, and if our model finds that the college that you went to and got your degree from is strongly predictive of credit performance, and we get an applicant in the door who went to Howard, for example, the model's probably going to give them a pretty low score because Howard is not associated with things the model thinks are associated with strong job performance. So by virtue of the sample selection, the other key factor that can drive discrimination, you can have discriminatory effects in the model.
Could you stay here?
Um,
Periodic problems.
Are we back up and working? Okay. I'm just gonna kind of zoom ahead because I know we have limited time. There we go. So, you know, some things that could lead to possible discriminatory effects, just very simple things. School that you attended, credit history. Credit history is actually correlated with things like race and ethnicity. Some of these things are correlated with prohibited factors because of historical discrimination that puts people of certain characteristics in certain circumstances and have different economic outcomes, okay? Memberships and affiliations, you know, do you belong to this club or that club, this fraternity, that religion, or, you know, this, some kind of social group. And geographic location. We know that there's a lot of geographic segregation in our society, especially in big cities. The use of geographic information can have very significant disparate effects in models. So I'm just going to talk very quickly, and this is all in the paper that's part of your conference materials, about how I, and some of us in the financial sector, think about vetting models or reviewing models, testing models for possible discriminatory effects, and then trying to manage that risk, okay, draw some guardrails around the use of these models. First, there's kind of a qualitative review process. Very obviously, you need to understand what goes into the models. Is there anything there that, as was mentioned, is actually a prohibited basis, something that's prohibited by law? Modelers are not always sensitive to those things, but also, is there anything in there that seems like it's likely to be correlated with a prohibited basis just because of what we know about society and economics? Is there reason to expect there could be a disparate effect? If there is, then maybe we want to do a little bit more homework and maybe test what the model is actually doing, what effects it really has. Do we know that there are actual correlations with prohibited factors? You don't always know the racial characteristics or gender characteristics or what have you of the people in your data sample, but in some contexts, a lot of times in the financial sector, you can actually come up with statistical proxies to at least on average gauge how likely it is that your model is going to have adverse effects on some prohibited basis. A key thing is, given all the stuff that goes in the model, assuming the model is not so opaque that we can't understand what's in the model, which is often a problem with these models, do those variables actually have a clear intuitive relationship to what we're trying to predict? You know, if I ran a bunch of data through a model, I found shoe size predicted credit performance. Well, it's not really obvious to me that that should be the case. Why is that? What's the relationship there? Is that stable over time? Is it something that we can explain with economic theory, understanding of human behavior? I think that if you can't draw that line between what the variable represents and what it's trying to predict, you should be kind of suspicious that maybe it's picking up something else. Maybe it's proxying for something else.
So, you know, when I listen to this, I think about the risk and the opportunity. If you
Yeah.
think about the fact that on an individual basis, some of that bias that you're talking about could go into people making those decisions. And the risk factors are small in a sense on an individual basis. But if you scale it up and do some of the things that, you know, we're talking about on a broader basis, then you go from an individual issue to a class action where, you know, the question of whether or not the disparate impact was business related and screened out one group or another becomes an issue. Now, if you then say, how do I do some of this right? Can you then have a bigger impact and also screen out bias? Now, there are a lot of these vendors, by the way, that will tell you that's what they do. And that's where the expertise of your, your internal heads of HR and your legal counsel are critical. because you know, there's just too much hype out there. I know we in the HR group, we gathered together 40 or 50 talent acquisition leaders to vet all of these vendors out there for that purpose. And I'm going to ask, and I'm going to turn now, if I can, to Kelly, because she is a former Chief Data and Statistical Officer for the Equal Opportunity Commission, and she now has come over to be a, an executive at Pymetrics, which is one of those partners with the HR community in the area of selection. So she is going to talk a little bit about how they have applied some of this capability in a way that meets the requirements of the Equal Opportunity Commission with her expertise.
Thanks.
Kelly?
Hi, everybody. So that was really, really interesting. So I worked for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission for about 8 years. I'm not a lawyer. My background is in psychology, actually, and statistics. So when I was at EEOC, obviously there's a bunch of lawyers and there's a bunch of investigators, but there is this other group of people that does analytics for systemic or class cases of discrimination. And that's what I did. I started as an analyst, and then before I left, I was running the group. And shortly before I left as well, we were focused on this big data area. There was a public hearing in 2016 on this topic from EEOC, which is on the website. So you can look at testimony from different experts who were invited in. I testified on behalf of the commission. And following that, then Chair Yang, who you will hear from tomorrow, I think, at lunch, and I see her in the back there, put me in charge of an internal task force on the topic of, what are we going to do about this at EEOC? What do we think about it? Do we need new guidance, so on and so forth? So it was a really exciting time. And then things changed a little bit. In terms of leadership, all the way up at the top in DC, you may have heard. And so there was a little bit of a lull in progress, and that's when I left and went and joined a vendor. And so when I got started doing this type of heading up this internal task force, I got to meet lots of vendors who were working in employment selection and hear from them. How does it work? I really wanted to understand. What do you do? How does it work? Do you know about Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964? Do you know about the Uniform Guidelines on Employee Selection Procedures? Do you know about validation, job relatedness, business necessity for using an assessment? And I heard a range of responses to those questions, which I'm sure you can imagine. Some vendors had really good answers. And I'm not here to sell anything, but I decided where to go based on answers that I was getting. And I got really good answers from a little outfit called Pymetrics, which is headquartered here in New York. And so Pymetrics utilizes algorithms, AI, for employment selection purposes. So if this is a little scary, which I've heard a little bit of fear, I think, this morning, going into our panel, if it's a little scary to think about artificial intelligence making employment selection decisions, that's where I started too. I thought it was scary. I thought it was dangerous. I thought it was bad. I thought these people don't know what they're doing. And now I work for one of them. So I've gone through quite an evolution in thinking about this. I really like the discussion about credit because actually I was focused on credit for employment selection purposes when I started to hear about big data and algorithms for selection. And the point about, credit scoring and credit history is quite linked up with the race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, is when I came upon that, I thought, this credit is not exactly, like a credit history screen is not exactly the same as using an algorithm for employment selection purposes, but the idea of scoring people based on their reputation and their background to predict future behavior, it's a very similar concept. And so all kinds of things like we heard about, I don't want to repeat because you heard a lot of really good points there, but I have heard of other vendors in this space using things like your zip code to make employment selection decisions. We already heard where you live, super tied up with your socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, and so on. I've heard other vendors talk about using things like, were you a member of chess club in college? Because that predicts future success. Were you on lacrosse team in college? Predicts future success. Obviously, we need to be critical thinkers, and we need to remember that there actually are regulations in place. As I mentioned, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act regulates employment selection with regard to race, ethnicity, gender. There are guidelines. They're old. 1978 is when the Uniform Guidelines on Employee Selection Procedures came out, but I'm actually still quite a fan of UGASP. I used it a lot when I was at EEOC. I use it now when I'm at a vendor. Basically, UGASP just says, you know, if you're using an employment selection device, you should test for fairness. I mean, it's not a mystery. The results of any test or selection procedure, whether it's algorithmic or not, you can look to see, are they different by race, ethnicity, gender? There, you can use pretty basic statistics to do these analytics. I do it now at Pymetrics for our clients, the way I did it when I was at EEOC and investigations. Any user of any selection device should be doing this type of work. Further, if you're using an employment selection procedure, UGASP says you're supposed to look at the job relevance. They talk about validity, and there's technical guidance in UGASP about how to do it. I could talk about that if I had time, but I won't bore you. And the third prong that UGASP talks about is the search for the least discriminatory alternative. And this is where it's kind of exciting, because vendors like Pymetrics can actually automate the search for the least discriminatory alternative. When you're using an algorithm, you don't have to stop at, okay, I've built a paper and pencil assessment, and now it just has to live on paper and pencil for 10 years before I will go back and change it. The nice thing about algorithms is that you can test multiple possibilities and find the one that is least likely to cause adverse impact and most job relevant and consistent with business necessity. You can automate that process, which is pretty freaking cool, if you ask me, and that's why I wanted to get in there and be a part of it. As I say, I can get into validity, but let me tell you a little bit real quick about just Pymetrics, and then I'll turn it over for just what we do. So Pymetrics actually has a set of people who have run through our assessments. We have 12 core assessments. It's a common platform that we use. And we have people who have run through our assessments in the past. We have their race, ethnicity, and gender, which they provided to us. So we call that a bias set. We have it, it sits there. When we build a custom assessment for a new client, successful incumbents that are already in the job at the company go through our 12 core assessments. We build a success profile or success model for that job, might be customer service at whatever company. So we have a custom success profile that we've built. Then we take what we call the bias set and we run these people through, like we built this assessment, how do these people perform? Again, it's not a mystery. Do men outperform women? Yes, no. Do whites outperform African Americans? Yes, no. Do Asians outperform Hispanics? We can see it before we ever deploy it. And if there's a difference, search for the next version. In fact, for every client, we build hundreds of possible models based on those successful incumbents that they've given us. And we choose the one, again, search for least discriminatory, most valid alternative. We choose the one that has the greatest potential to separate the successful incumbents from a baseline and does not result in adverse impact based on our bias set. So we have a common platform, all successful incumbents and then candidates go through the same 12 assessments. What's going on using AI in the background is building the best possible success profile for that job, for that company. And the types of inputs we're using are not chess club or lacrosse team or zip code or anything silly. I mean, I'm sure you've heard of all kinds of interesting examples, like there was something in the popular literature not long ago about people who press like for curly fries on Facebook. It's related to your intelligence somehow. That's a bit of an old.
Which way?
Yeah, I know. That's a bit of an old example, but it just shows you the silliness. Any of us who took stats class learned things like murder rates and ice cream sales are correlated in cities across the United States. Do you think that people, when they have a cone, want to go kill somebody? Or vice versa? No. It's probably a third variable problem. What do you think the third variable is that's correlated with both of those? Heat. Yeah, when it's hot, people are more aggressive, turns out. And, you also go buy more ice cream cones. So you got to be careful about these. You mentioned it as well, these correlations. We don't use silly things like that. We actually use assessments that were built by academics that are existing in the literature, and this gives us a kind of validation that not all vendors in this space have, called construct validation from the Uniform Guidelines. So when I tell you we measured things like attitudes towards risk, processing, planning, levels of emotion, I can actually go back to published literature and tell you, here's exactly how I know we're measuring attention, processing, emotion, and so on and so forth. So I guess I can feel Jonna wanting to get in there. The last thing I'll say about this is that these new approaches can absolutely fit into the older guidelines. I'm not saying there isn't room for improvement. This is sort of something I was excited about right before I left EEOC. Wouldn't it be cool to write a guidance for employers and vendors to follow specifically? This is what we need to do when we're using algorithms. It's needed. I would like to see it. But in the absence of that, there are existing guidelines, and we should all pull out the uniform guidelines and employee selection procedures, dust them off, read them, and ask ourselves, if we're using algorithms either built internally or by a vendor, would they pass these requirements? And they absolutely should. There's no reason why we should be using things like curly fries and zip codes and lacrosse team. There are really good metrics out there to be using that are job-related, consistent with business necessity, and are not unfair to people, who are non-white or women or what have you, older workers, people with disabilities, and so on and so forth.
So,
John?
yes.
Could we draw a distinction between two different I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut.
No, it's okay, go ahead.
In my own mind, I draw a distinction between two different situations. There's one situation that involves the screening of thousands and thousands of applications where there may be room for an algorithm so that it's, something manageable for the company. And it certainly beats what its alternative will be, which will be, is there a Harvard grad in the pile? Or something arbitrary. So that's one situation where I think, if done the right way, it's a very defensible use of AI and machine learning will come from experience. Where my sort of hackles get raised is when we're now using something to grade or evaluate our incumbent employees for promotion or for termination or whatever. That troubles me. And the reason that troubles me is the reason I once gave to a service provider many, many years ago when I was at Cahill Gordon, who wanted to come in and sell us on sell our client on the use of a pencil and paper test to decide promotion decisions. I said, that doesn't make any sense. We have a performance track record from these employees. We've been living with them. We've got measures of what we thought were successful performance. Why are we going to give them an aptitude test? Because we're familiar with the traditional impact problems with that. So I talked the company out of it. I'm some of the same reaction here. I don't understand the case for relying on AI methods or machine learning for making decisions where you have better information from the actual experience with the incumbent employees. Now, there may be an area where it would be useful, but that's where I think, that's my intuition, maybe it's not other people's intuition, but
Yeah,
if in
okay.
fact that reflects the intuition of courts, you're asking for trouble. And on
But
top of that, the formal requirement of these statutes is that if there is a disparate impact, you must show both job relatedness and business success.
necessity.
So even if it's a good predictive device, this is to some extent what.
So the uniform guidelines specify what is
Before we
meant
get to
by
uniform
what.
guidelines, they are so complicated. I'm not sure you give me solace here, but, and expensive. I mean, you're talking about, having, you call it a bias group, even your terminology is problematic, Kelly.
I'm sorry, I don't understand.
And all of it is
the point.
discoverable. In other words, I'm not sure you want, if the requirement is you have to have an empirical test of what you are doing, it seems to me you're better off not doing it, when in fact you have better information from the incumbent workforce.
So, Sam, you're saying actual job performance, we have that data, we have that information.
You've been living with these employees, and you've been living with their willingness to take risks and whether they've done things outside of the box and whether they've shown initiative. You need to now have some sort of database. I think companies are asking to be a target of disparate impact litigation.
So the algorithms are built on the data that you're talking about, though. You understand that, right? Like, we start with successful incumbents, so
Yes,
you're
I know, I
using a
understand.
data-driven approach to do what you're saying. Is this on? You start with a data-driven approach to do exactly what you're saying. So your point about
Well, if all
what's
the,
the case?
if all the intelligence is doing is aggregating information, I don't know how many employees we're talking about, why that can't be done by more traditional methods. I don't understand.
Well, let me
I
just-
know you're testing against an incumbent workforce.
Let me just throw something else in here. And Sam, to your point, the assumption here is that the performance management metrics that we've historically relied on remain constant. And that is clearly not the case in HR today.
Right.
More and more companies are moving away from annual performance reviews Our company did away with it several years ago. Other big companies have done away with it. They've gone to more iterative types of approaches where you get more instant feedback. And, I used to fight the battle inside my company when we went and did this, that where's my information? Where can I get data that will become actionable if necessary for performance management? It's one thing to have a nice conversation with your employees. I'm a firm believer in that. And I think most good managers do. They have a really good pulse of what's going on in their organization. But when you take away the traditional indicators of performance, no performance appraisal, no ranking, nothing, what do you have then? You have to look for other sources. And this is where algorithms might come into play. You might have to do a variety of things to collect together to replace what you had before. And this was one of the challenges. When we went from annual performance reviews to this softer connect session thing that they did quarterly, which wasn't mandatory, by the way, and it wasn't documented in any, and I'm thinking, well, what's the whole purpose of this? And I said they wanted to do away with employee improvement plans, or a PIP, performance improvement plans, where it's where you put people on a plan if they're not doing well. You've identified a problem, you've gone and said, we have to intervene, it's an intervention step. And they wanted to do away with that too. And I said, no, because things are going to happen, people are people, performance is going to lag, the people are going to do their jobs, and you have to figure out a way that you can document that from a risk perspective that Sam is talking about, so that you can protect your company. And also, my view was, give you an opportunity to intervene effectively before you had to make an ultimate decision. I was the grand terminator at my company. I was the George Clooney of my company. I flew around the world terminating senior executives for over a decade. But
It's a movie.
yeah, it's a movie.
Up in the air.
Up in the air. But you have to figure out. And so the thing that's sort of sticking out for me is the way we do things today is not the way we did things 4, 5, 6 years ago.
So, and let me separate out if I can. You have your work, there's work today that is where, when you're dealing with productivity, certain types of work, where there are all kinds of potential things that are not only getting done now and being thought of, where there's more specific measurements that, I don't know if you saw the article in the Wall Street Journal a few months ago, where in Amazon, they basically terminate people, they reach a certain low productivity and they're terminated by, quote, machine. I think that for most of us in HR, we would say taking away the discretion of a manager to intervene in a situation to who knows that employee, et cetera, is a problem. But at least there are specifics. When you get into professional ranks and more, white-collar knowledge workers, it's a different situation. So even when we had, quote, performance reviews, as you say, were they less subjective? Were they less objective? And oftentimes, when you got into a situation where their ability to do that job changed with the requirements of the job, you still were in a situation where, oh, well, are you going to terminate them, or you're just going to work through a process? Mm-hmm. And that's the reality. So I think the question of, and this is the question that I think we're grappling with now, we're grappling with in the human resources profession. How far do you go? And what kind of standards should we collectively set before stupid facts make bad law and bad regulation? And that is the thing that is really, I think what we think about, because I know there's OECD came out with principles, standards that companies should think about in terms of how they manage this, how they set standards around data, and I think we do have to start to have to think about that. And there is also the reality that as these jobs change and the skill requirements change, it's a huge issue for us, as you said, Roger, the gap between what we need and what is going to be required. This is what worries. If you ask what worries, like CEOs, do we have the talent? You can't. I mean, if you're a data scientist today, believe me, you can make more money than any number of professions that you would think about. and data navigators, et cetera. So it's a changing world. The question is, and that's some of what I think was built into the discussion just before us, is there are some people that can't make that switch. And in the past, when we went in the industrial age or macro, it was more time. Today, it's so quick. These things change so quick. How do we adapt? How are we going to deal with dislocated workers? How do we train them? And believe me, because it's such a talent war, we're thinking all the time, how are we going to skill up? How do we
Right.
skill up, the workers that we have? So I don't know if anybody else wants to comment on any of
No,
what I
it's-
I'd
said.
really like to respond to the use case question because I don't think I was very clear. Pymetrics does hiring, employment selection, and oftentimes clients come to us and say, I've got thousands of applicants, and I don't know how to get down to a more reasonable group of people to interview, move forward to a more hands-on kind of process. And so maybe I'm even afraid to open up my recruitment funnel to different kinds of groups. Like maybe I only recruit from the top schools, and I don't want to open up to different kinds of like state universities and such. I don't know where you all went to school. I didn't go anywhere fancy. So if they were recruiting from only the top schools, I never would have gotten a chance. And so we tend to have clients come to us and say, it's very high applicant flow. We need a fair measure that will demonstrate ROI, go on to predict good people. And so that's the type of use case that we're often used for.
Yeah,
Just to
I think
clarify.
he was talking about the question of people that are already here and you have experience in. I will say, I'll tell you an example of the issue that you just raised about can you broaden your aperture in terms of by using some of these tools. So I know a company that made a decision to apply an AI, a machine learning technology, to a wide variety of schools for purposes of bringing that entry-level professional in. And they based it on certain core capabilities that they felt anybody would be most successful in their company. And so what that did is that, and how did they do that, by the way? They did it not with an individual applicant where they went around maybe to 5 schools and do recruiting, but they sent this, they made it available to all these schools, and a student can come in and they have effectively a avatar that does a video AI assessment of them. They respond to this avatar. They can do it. If they don't like it, they can stop it and redo it again. And then it goes into an analytical a screening process, and they bring back a certain group of students for those live one-to-one interviews. So, so you can say and did they do it and we did. I did press him when I heard him speak. I won't say the company because and I did say, well, how did you make sure that you were doing it appropriately, et cetera? And they said they did. They felt though, they were only able at this point to do it with that entry level where they could base it on sort of core capabilities that they think transcended, specific job requirements at that moment. Once it went up to your point, Sam, once it became, how do I bring somebody up to the next level and the next level, they were more reluctant.
Right.
And so when they had experience with people within the company. So I think I'm probably going to stop now and ask if there's any questions out there, because I think we just got a little bit of time left. Any
There's
questions?
a law that's just passed in Illinois that's waiting for the governor to sign it. HB 2557, the Artificial Intelligence Video Interview Act. That's very relevant to what you're talking about, and it would require employers using such video
Which state is this, Kelly?
analytics to notify, inform, and obtain consent from
Illinois?
applicants.
Illinois.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me.
Any questions out there?
Any questions or comments? Please, please.
It's requiring that employers using video analytics for
We're
artificial
talking this
intelligence
Illinois statute that's about to become law in Illinois.
to notify, inform, and obtain consent from candidates who will be analyzed using AI through video specifically.
All right, any questions or comments? Please come to
It's very
the,
European, the approach is very European.
No questions?
please come, no, we have
Yes,
one right here on
please.
the left.
Jonathan Harris, I'm here at NYU School of Law. I wanted to pick up on something I think you mentioned at the beginning about scaling these up, and just get a sense of how much of this companies are using or contemplating using in the near future, given that when you're using algorithms, a slight issue on the front end may become a huge issue when you're applying it across the board, and the
Right.
risk that you're looking at on the other end with litigation and that sort of thing.
I mean, I can only say collectively, not just for our company, but what I know about, what's happening in this world is kind of what I said in the beginning. There's so much focus on this from a purpose of how can you use this to become more effective and efficient, and how can you manage your talent better. It's a big business issue. So I don't think there's no way it's going away. And the only question is, again, how do we manage this effectively and constructively going forward? So I don't think this is just beginning, the way I see it in terms of the trends that I see.
And per your question, as Jonna mentioned earlier, at HR Policy, we have screened and are going to keep rescreening the providers out there, because you're absolutely right. A misstep here or there at the front end could cause very expensive collective action, class action litigation. So you have to use these tools exceedingly carefully and thoughtfully. And, I really had a question, David. Go back to the old school, look at the essential functions of the job, which we can identify, and we can put correlation data. We can put data together to show successful performers, right? But talk to us just about best practices here.
Well, best practices for what? So I think, it goes to some of the stuff that Kelly was talking about. It gets down to being very careful, making sure that you have a process for understanding the model, how it was derived, curating the data so you know where it comes from, and you can assess potential for bias, going through the steps of testing the model for statistical validity, doing that independently, having kind of checks and balances along the way, a governance structure, in other words, to make sure that you're making very deliberate decisions about the models, and it's not, frankly, a bunch of quants just sort of running around having fun. So it requires a great deal of care and checking and kind of a governance process.
Did you want to say something, Bob?
Yeah, I just wanted to just throw out one concept is, we're talking a lot about machine and, automatic and this, that, and the other. One of the concepts that, we grapple with is, the AI types of processes can do a lot of the brute force types of analysis up to a point today. So we're talking about today. Check back 2 years from now, and it'll be a very different conversation. Things will change, things will happen. There will be a lot of broken crockery, I should probably use crockery out there in the process. Bad things will happen inadvertently, and we're going to be learning from this all the time. But recognize that this is the world we live in today. This is not going away. This is, so the question is for employers, how do you embrace this smartly? How do you use it to the advantage of your business for talent and for performance management and for merit and things of that nature? How do you do that smartly? So senior HR folks like Jonna and Roger, they're focused on this because everyone in corporate America has the same problem. That's an issue that needs to be addressed. And you could turn a blind eye to it, or you can embrace it in some meaningful way, recognizing, though, that we don't live in there's not a perfect solution for any of this stuff.
And
We have a
not just-
comment here on John, I'm sorry.
I was just going to, not from
Comment on
just
left.
the business perspective, but from the employee perspective.
Right.
There's lots of things that you can do in terms of wellness. There's things that we haven't talked about, which you can use for even, very
Right.
positive effects. I'm sorry, Sam, go
Right.
ahead.
We have to be careful also to avoid a legal overreaction.
Right.
Which
On the
can-
regulatory
which
side.
Which could happen,
Yeah.
yes.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Marcia Tal. I'm the CEO of Tal Solutions and prior Executive Vice President at Citibank, and I ran all of the analytics for Citigroup globally.
Right.
So I have a lot of experience on this topic. And while I could comment on many of the things that were said, one of the most important thing I think that might not have been addressed is the gap I see in analytic leadership roles at the executive level. And I think that the more that you can, both organizationally and at a talent level, create these types of roles, the more a lot of these issues will go away because you'll have a person that's accountable. So that was my job.
Yeah.
And what I would say is that there are great opportunities for very talented people to have a career growth in this space. And really, there's kind of a gap in standardization and organizational design around these type of roles.
Very good point. Thank you.
I think you're absolutely right.
Larry?
Yeah, just,
Larry Carey.
I always try to make it real. So you're going to have a machine and a videotape interview of some sort on the college campus.
What's a videotape? What is
Well,
that?
a picture of people talking.
Recording.
And you're going to apply 37 different variables to analyzing this experience. I mean, in real terms, what are you looking for in that process? And, you know, and what are you actually measuring, and what is the person actually telling you? And just apropos of consent, I don't know what consent would mean, really, without reading the statute. But people want a job, so they're going to consent regardless of anything else. So it's practically meaningless as far as I'm concerned. But in real terms, what do you actually look at for purposes of making a decision? What are the variables that correlate, with validity and reliability for making these decisions? And just as a second question, which you don't have to get to, is where does human creativity fall in that process? Because that's one variable that, seems
That's why you
difficult to
asked the
measure.
question, when is the last time you did something new?
Yeah, I mean, I have not implemented this, so I can't tell you exactly what this particular company did what they were looking for. I would suggest that there are certain core skills that they try to test for, team behavior and ability to learn, willingness to learn, initiative. There's certain things that they, that they're looking for in terms of who do they want coming out of college for their particular business.
Well, just a couple of years ago, one of the big financial houses, I think it was Goldman Sachs, decided that they were no longer going to do interviews. They were, because everybody walks on water, they're all, top of their class in all these fancy schools and whatnot, and they were looking for something different. They were looking for that variable. They were looking for what they called, if you remember this, Roger, grit.
Yes.
Grit, that's right.
They were looking for grit.
Grit.
And we looked at that and go, what the heck does that mean? Well, it means something to them. They could, I think they could define what they meant by it. Nobody else could. But it's the same kind of thing. It's that variability. It's those types of things that you're trying to extract out of the data. So they did away with the personal interviews, and they were scraping resumes with grit until such time as people figured out what grit meant, and then they were populating their resumes with what all the grit speak. So then people are infinitely creative when it comes to these kinds of things. So you got to keep on top of these things.
So the video stuff, I wish it was just like your skills and knowledge, skills, abilities is what IO psychologists have been trying to assess for ages. The video stuff gets beat up pretty good because there are a lot of passive behaviors. When you're doing an interview, whether it's on video or you're talking to someone, you think you're being judged by the content of what you're saying, which is the traditional way of doing it. A lot of the video interview stuff is based on analytics that are not necessarily touching the content. They're touching things like your facial expressions, your hand movements, the tone of your voice, your pauses between words, and so on and so forth. So they're using lots and lots and lots of passive data points to build a success profile for what is success in a job. Now, the company I work for is not doing this. I'm just aware of it. And that is why the Illinois law talks about inform. Rather than just telling people, here, record yourself doing a video, we're going to use AI to analyze these videos. And the Illinois law, if you should look it up, actually does talk about you will need to specify the general variables, characteristics on which you will be analyzing these people. And so at least as a candidate, I hear you. I mean, I would sign it if I wanted the job anyway, so I got it. But at least as the candidate, Because a lot of the concern has been candidates don't even realize that these things are happening, so they can't bring a charge of discrimination, right? This was my concern at EEOC. It continues to be a concern. But at least if I know, oh, this is an assessment, they're using the following bits of information about me. If I feel that I was discriminated against based on my protected characteristic, at least I can bring a charge of discrimination if I'm informed and aware. So I think that's the spirit behind the Illinois law.
On the left here, he's been waiting patiently. Please identify
so-
yourself again.
I'm Greg. My background is in HR. So
Greg, what is your last name again?
Berdia, sorry. My background's in HR, but I'm actually a recent college graduate. So I've experienced using video interviews like HireVue, familiar how they work. I actually didn't know, to your point, that all of the things that they passively analyzed in the process. So my perspective on video interviewing totally changed when I became aware of what was going on. So that's what I'm sure the CHRO people already know what I'm getting at. How are applicants responding to?
Are they gaming the video? Is that what you're
Well,
saying?
that will happen anyway. But so I'm not asking about that. But how do they feel going through? You want to hire this person, but you just put them through 3 rounds of interviews with no one on the other side.
Right.
So how do they feel? To O'Hara's point, this is the world we're in. It doesn't mean the workforce likes it. There's a lot of things
Well,
we're in that.
And I do think
Employer-
that those are some of the things
point.
that we're going to have to face. As I said, we don't do that because I have some of the concerns that you expressed, but there is reality of, when you get into these situations and you have, if this is going to become the way that it's done, that's why you have to, as a society, as a profession, we have to figure out what makes sense and what doesn't make sense.
Absolutely.
I do want to just, while you were up before, I was going to stop you and tell you this. You raised that question to the panel before about the assumptions and whatever. There is a World Forum, really good World Forum paper, which does an analysis of 8 scenarios that could happen relative to the reaction politically, socially, and economically to some of these trends. And so I just recommend it to you in terms of the question you asked before.
We have one more. Keep it short because we have to go on to the next segment. Yes?
Okay, my question is for
Your name,
Ms.,
please.
For Ms. Trindle. My name is Natalie Mahul, and my question is, how can one prove there was a discrimination when an AI algorithm is used? Because first of all, usually people trust AI programs like in financial consulting. People, even in false consulting or in wrong consulting, people kept trusting the algorithms. So in this case, who's the burden of proof on the employee? We'll
talk about it tomorrow. We're actually
applicant
covering this tomorrow, yes.
Yeah,
Well,
Discrimination
real quickly,
issues.
I just want to say, I know we're out of time, but for all of our clients, we do adverse impact testing on the candidates. So everything I talked about is before build, so we try to reduce the possibility of adverse impact. But then once it's live, it's not a mystery. We just collect the information. As you go through the process, voluntarily, what is your gender, your candidate, what is your gender, what is your race, you self-identify, or you choose not to, whatever. We take the data that we have, and we know objectively, was there a significant difference in performance by gender, race, ethnicity, age, we also ask about. And then the other thing we do for all of our clients is predictive validity testing. The people who we recommended for you to hire, did they go on to perform better in whatever way we define that going in a way that's supported by actual metrics? So nothing is a mystery. We actually indemnify all of our clients, and so it is a due diligence requirement for us to do these types of analyses on the back.
I would say, though, the bottom line is, if there isn't that kind of care done with whatever vendor you're talking about, and they don't analyze, and the employer doesn't analyze, is this having an adverse impact? Because we know any selection on its own, if that element itself is having an adverse impact, then it has to be, as we know, it has to be justified.
And we even
So-
actually have a law firm who's a client of ours,
Just it.
O'Melveny and Myers.
I love
And
the
as you can
firm.
imagine,
I've been on the, I've been
law
a member of the
firms
firm.
are a little careful.
This is very hard, by the way, to prove discriminatory intent. It's very, very difficult. We'll talk about it tomorrow. Please join Jana and me in thanking this terrific panel.